Hello, everyone, and thank you again for coming to yet another Monolith Soft tier ranking list. We are yet again here ranking some Monolith Soft games. I don't know when you'll see this video because the game I'm talking about today is something I kind of want to be on the down low about at the moment because I would like to make a video that presents this game in like a fun way, I think. And so I don't really want to talk about it too much, and so I still need to make that video. But part of doing the ranking today, I think to some extent, is helping me find some of the words I'm looking for and some of the direction I'm looking for in talking about this game. And so I did want to go ahead and record this so I could use that as kind of like a helpful baseline to figure out like what I'm trying to communicate about this game in a lot of ways. So, obviously today's going to be a bit more informal. And if I've made that video, you should go watch that video because that's going to be a lot cleaner in terms of what I'm talking about. That's not saying this video is useless. Obviously, we're going to have our own little fun time, pitting this game against different games on this list or whatever. So there's like some uniqueness to that. But I will try to go through and just kind of explain what I like about Hackox first and foremost. I said the name of the game there. It's called Hackox. We'll get into Hackox detail here in a second. So we're going to do a ranking. We're going to put it on here. The thing about Hackox, though, and you might notice my picture for Hackox is a little iffy. It's the title screen of the game, but because of how Tier Maker works, it cut it off, and now apparently I cannot replace it without deleting this whole list and remaking it. So that's not something I want to do today. This is Hackox, though, just so you know, on screen here. But a lot of people might argue that like Hackox shouldn't even be on this list, which is perfectly fine. We talked about like whether or not, Xenoblade Chronicles Future Connected should even be on this list, given kind of how it's positioned. However, this is my list, so I'm having a good time, having a fun time. But I think the reason why maybe I single out Hackox specifically is that it is, in a lot of ways, its own standalone game, and what makes Hackox good is completely separate from the game that it's in. Nothing really, well, there's a very slight tie to the game that's in that I think makes Hackox interesting, but for the most part, it is its own entirely separate thing than the game itself. Just, you have to play the game to actually get to it. So the game that Hackox is a part of is Xenosaga Episode 3. So in Episode 3, there's like an arcade machine, and you can go in there, and you can play this little like puzzle game. So what Hackox is basically, I guess you could call it like Lemmings in some way. You're like, have these characters who are walking around, they have colors assigned to them, there's 4 different colors, and those characters move automatically. And so when they are walking down these paths, they will do things based off, basically a set logic. So like if they hit like a juncture where they can go left or right, they will always turn right because that's just what they're programmed to do essentially, right? And if they hit a edge where it's like a hard edge straight down, they will turn around if there's like no other way for them to go. So they'll always turn around. So they'll always turn away from that ledge. However, if they're on a slope and the slope goes down and the slope has an edge on it, they will walk off the slope and fall down either to the platform below or in some cases off into the abyss, and they are gone basically. So you lose the ability to score points using that character essentially. So like 3D Lemmings is probably the best way to like think of this in a lot of ways. However, this game is not just a Lemmings clone. There's a lot of things really unique about Hackox, and I think that's why I want to talk about it today and why I want to rank it on its own, because I think this game is something that I've always enjoyed about Xenosaga Episode 3, but it's something that I realized in playing it again that is maybe one of my favorite puzzle games of all time. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. One, I think is because there's like a physics element to it. And I think that physics element like adds, and like momentum as well. So physics and momentum are kind of big parts of it. And it adds like this very tactile feel to the game, despite it being fairly hands-off. And the other part of it is that there are a lot of mechanics in this game that layer on in ways that they have their own function, but they also are part of various different elements of this game. So like whether or not how fast a character is moving or things like that applies in a lot of different situations. And so you have to be very mindful of how characters are moving around the board and what speed they're moving around the board and things like that. So I think that's kind of like a big part of what like makes Hackox good. So when I say physics elements, what exactly that means is not really apparent, I think, super early on in the game. So kind of the main way you interact in Hackox is that you have the 4 face buttons on the controller, and that lets you basically move blocks around. So there's blocks assigned to the circle button, blocks assigned to the X button, things like that. And how those blocks move around and what they do varies per stage. So sometimes it will be simply a wall. So basically, if you want a character to turn at a particular point, that block, you need to move into the spot that, you know, these are kind of set spots on the screen. So you need to like move into the spot, and then it'll go ahead and like let them turn when they hit that block, versus if that block wasn't there, they just walk past that intersection kind of thing, right? And then also there are gonna be like multiple blocks assigned to the same button. So you kind of have to be aware of multiple different places where you're affecting the board at once. But they also can be used to hit your little like lemming characters, basically. I mean, the characters are just Xenosaga characters, but the little characters that are walking along, you can use to hit them, either to push them somewhere, slide them into a different slot, or launch them off ledges, or even make them jump as well. So if they're on top of it, they can launch into the air. And how that works, or like how the character moves based or reacts based off that, maybe is the better word, is dependent on a variety of things. One is their movement speed. So there's 3 different movement speeds in this game. There's the standard walking speed, there's the fast walking speed, and there's also a running speed. And so if they're running and you launch them in the air, they jump significantly further versus if they're fast walking or if they're doing the normal walk, essentially. And there's also like some weird things that the game doesn't always like actually ask the player to interact with some of these things, but like angles and things like that of like if a character's turning when they're on the block can matter as well. So you can do things that like if you're a really good player, you can essentially have a character like be angled right and then have them launch way to the other side of the board, and like depending on your angle that you launched them at, you can land them in like a place that like basically skips the entire board if you want to. But like the timing on those angled turns and stuff are really hard to do. So like most of the time those angles are more of a bad thing of like, oh, you pressed the button way too late and now the character's launching off to the side and not landing on the platform you want them to land on. But you can also use that to like your advantage in a lot of ways. The speed aspect of like them running around also is just something that is beneficial from like the timer aspect. The faster characters move, the quicker they're going to go ahead and turn in, and so you can finish the stage faster. But again, there's like various different elements about like how they move, how they react to things depending on their walking speed, that you don't just like it's not just about how fast can you react to things. It also is about how that character will respond to the speed that they're moving and things like that. So there's a lot of like really tactile things to this game and how it works. It just feels like when you're interacting with the world, the characters feel, in some ways, I guess maybe like feel a bit more real. It like feels less of a puzzle game. I think they literally call it like a puzzle action game or something like that. So it feels more like maybe like an action puzzle game than it does, even though you, the player, are not directly controlling any of these characters beyond like the run speed they have and things like that. However, another really big key element of this game is scoring. And obviously, that makes a lot of sense. So like, oh, you need to score, right? But like how you score in this game is really important because there's a variety of different things you have to consider in regard to this. So when you start a match, or a board essentially, it will have things where like you have a set amount of stock for the number of characters that will spawn, right? And they spawn in at different intervals and things like that. Sometimes it feels a little more random. Sometimes it feels a bit more like, static based off how they design the level and things like that. So like when they spawn in, you have to kind of pay attention to like what order they're spawning in at, and also like where they're spawning at as well, because that can play a big role. But like kind of the thing you're trying to do, if possible, is turn in multiple characters all at once. Now, they don't have to go turn into the same goal. They can all just turn in at different goals. But the big thing is like having them chain, because what can happen in this game is you'll get like a stock of 5 characters. However, the score you'll need will be 10. So if you just play the game, as not casually, like as safe as possible and just turn in one character at a time, you cannot beat that board because you don't have enough characters. So what you have to do is you have to pair characters together and get combos to get more stock. Even if a board doesn't require this, it can also be helpful for just making sure that if you mess up at any point, you still have leftover stock so you can go ahead and turn characters in. And this game's just has an incredibly complex level of not only in terms of character paths, but also the character speeds, what they move, and how that impacts how you can turn those characters in all at once, and ways you can use the face buttons to basically change kind of the position of characters and try to get them closer and closer to each other in a lot of ways, or alter, not even closer physically, but just closer to the range of which they're at the different goals and things like that. And you can also kind of speed up respawn, or the character spawning as well. So there's like a different, like another element on top of like their movement speed, in which when a character starts spawning, you get this little indicator that starts flying down, and you can press the button and basically speed up the spawn. But the spawn isn't instantaneous. There's still a timing aspect to it. So you have to kind of like figure out the timing of like when a character is passing over certain points and when's a good time to spawn them, because once you have them there, then they'll be synced, in which they'll go ahead and be turned in at the same time, kind of thing. So, and so this game is just really complex. It's a very simple game. You're moving blocks with the face buttons. You're pressing the shoulder buttons to speed up or speed or things like that, like speed up the two characters, and you're pressing a button to spawn them. That's really all there is here for the most part. But the way way you like control these characters through those elements, and like what it means to speed up a character, and like what that impacts in terms of like each game, and like how that plays out, changes how the game plays out when you're playing it, I think is like really, really in depth in a way that like I feel like a lot of puzzle games I've played in the past don't feel like. I feel like this game has a lot more complexity behind it than even some other puzzle games I've played in my life. That's not to say that like I'm a puzzle game expert. There's tons of complex puzzle games out there, don't get me wrong. But I think like part of the problem with me with like all puzzle games is just like this feeling that I'm disconnected from the action of what's happening. And so when I'm trying to think about like how things combo together and things like that, it's almost like this like layer between me and the what I need to do to score in the game, where it's hard for me to kind of like wrap my mind around like how to create a combo in like a game like this is a falling block puzzle game when I talk about this other game, not Hackox. Hackox not a falling block puzzle game. I mean, it's a block game where you fall off the blocks, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about here. But like, when I think of games like Puyo Puyo and things like that, like sometimes it can be hard for me to wrap my mind around like how things can be chained together. And I think the thing with Hackox is that it's like such a physical game in terms of how do you control it, that it makes it a lot easier to kind of understand, how these combos can be created and things like that. So, it's definitely not the longest, like, it's not I don't know, like, I think some puzzle games, personally, I think puzzle games are better short. I like a puzzle game that's going to take me 3 hours or so, and Hackox took me about 2 hours to get through, and I really, really enjoyed, like, the depth there. And, like, one aspect that is connected to the Xenosaga games, as well as the characters walking around, and I think that's the one thing that I can say about, like, is a bonus if you're a fan of the Xeno franchise, is that you get to see these characters in like really silly situations, and when they fall off the edge and stuff like that, they'll scream and they'll say like random stuff that just like is really goofy. So like a character can be fairly serious in the story, but then they're saying some like silly thing as they fall off, like, oh, I couldn't have seen this coming or something. I don't know. Or kos-mos is the easiest one, because she's like, I'm sorry, I'm unable to complete my mission, and she falls down. So yeah, I love Hackox, and like I remember liking Hackox, but in revisiting it, I was like, holy crap, I love Hackox. It is, gosh, I can't think of any puzzle game that I like better than it at the moment. Maybe I'll be wrong and like think of something later, but like, yeah, I love Hackox, and it's really kind of a shame that it is locked away in this RPG that is the third entry in this RPG series that is reliant on you playing the first 3 games to really enjoy it to, the quote fullest extent, right? What exactly that means, especially with the Xeno franchise, is a whole other thing. But I think it's generally reasonable to expect somebody will play Xenosaga episode 1, 2, and 3, and they get the majority of what they need. There are other things and things like that, like web series novel stuff or whatever, and like I think there's some value to that for sure. But I don't think that's like what most people will be experiencing, right? I think probably somebody just jumping in and just playing Xenosaga episode 3 would be a fascinating thing to hear about. Although most Europeans maybe, because only episode 2 ever came out in Europe, so it'd be an interesting game to see like how they felt about it and things like that. But yeah, so Hackox is great. I love Hackox. It is great. I love it. I think that's all I got to say about Hackhawks at this moment. Again, if I made a video about it, hopefully I communicated what I love about Hackhawks in that video and why I feel that game should be accessible to more people. And it's a real shame that the guy who seems to be kind of the main guy on Hackhawks seems to more or less just kind of disappear after Xenosaga Episode 3. I could be wrong. I just wasn't able to find anything about the guy last I checked. And maybe, hey, cool, if I worked it out in the video, maybe I'll talk about it there. But I'm going to take a strong guess I probably didn't, because I don't know what else I would look up at this point with that stuff. So I love Hackhawks. Anyways, we need to rank Hackhawks. Again, I just think the conversation around Hackhawks is so different from Xenosaga Episode 3, I don't think it's really worth putting it with Xenosaga Episode 3 on this list. So, oh gosh, we gotta start high on this list, I feel like. But I don't know, maybe we should start low, just to get through it. Project Cross Zone, easy, 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 easy. Xenogears, easy. Saga, easy, 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 easy. Disaster. Disaster Day of Crisis, I think it's a better game than Disaster Day of Crisis. Better than Soulbringer, better than Endless Frontier, definitely better than Future Redeemed. Xenosaga Chronicles X, I think it's better than both of these games. I think it's better than Baten Kaitos Origins as well. Okay, we're in A tier. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. There's so much I respect about like how much Xenoblade Chronicles 2... So, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. If you don't know, a game... In me playing it, I enjoyed it, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of things I like about Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I'm still incredibly surprised people were as receptive to it as they were, because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 to me feels like a Xenosaga Episode 2 in terms of how people view it. I should say, I actually like Xenosaga Episode 2 a lot for a lot of reasons, and I haven't revisited it in its entirety recently. But when I think about like what people think about Xenosaga Episode 2, I feel like that's what Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is in reality, where I feel like Xenosaga Episode 2 is maybe not so much that in reality, from my point of view as somebody who's not played it recently. So like the pieces of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are really interesting and good, but I don't think they come together in the way that I think Hackhawks really comes together. And so I feel like it's pretty easy for me to put Hackhawks above Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenosaga Episode 2, I recently revisited the story of Xenosaga Episode 2, and I think maybe my biggest complaint about that is just the center part of that story is really kind of, I guess, it like skips over. It's a time skip, essentially, and I think it handles it okay. I think it's not, the nice thing about it is, like, unlike Xenogears, where the time skip, like, is this long thing at the end of the game you kind of have to sit through and, like, hope the player stays on board for the whole process. Episode 2, like, it's the poison pill. They're like, hey, take it down. We're going to just a war started. And there's probably a lot of things we should tell you about this war. And there probably should have been a great long section of this game that explains this war. We don't have the time and money for that right now. We need to get you to the second part of this video game. So we're going to launch you through this. And so I respect that, even though it's obviously bad in that regard, that part of that. Gosh, I think this is going to be the real first pushback, because I'm trying to think of, like, Xenosaga Episode 2. I love the combat Xenosaga Episode 2. I will say when it comes to combat Xenosaga Episode 2, it is a long, I guess you'd say, each battle in Xenosaga Episode 2 has an investment in it. And what I mean by that is the zoning system of Xenosaga Episode 2 requires you to learn the zoning aspects of each enemy. Assuming I remember all this correctly. But so like you have to kind of learn each new enemy you come across and try to figure out like what you need to do with that enemy to get them in a position that you can make them be launched in the air, right? It's basically the break, launch, topple system, smash system, right? It is essentially that without the names of it, if I recall correctly. And the execution of it's very different than like what the later Xeno games would do. But it is a process you have to learn, and something like The Last Rebellion on the PS3 in some ways tries to replicate this to some extent, but takes it to kind of extreme. So I feel like that's part of why people don't like the combat of this game as much. I wonder if that bothers me at this point. It didn't really bother me much at the time, but I think in hindsight, I think I would notice it, that it's a problem, because people have told me about it being a problem when I look at it. I don't know if I would have noticed that when I was playing it, because I enjoyed just trying to figure it out then at that time. So it's kind of one of those weird things where, like, this is my list, and I think of the flaws that Xenosaga Episode 2 has, but I feel like a lot of the flaws that game has, I think, is what other people feel about it, and I've just kind of been like, oh, I see that, but I don't necessarily feel like those are my feelings on it. And I think that's maybe why I started with, like, that time skip thing, because I feel like that time skip thing in Xenosaga Episode 2 is maybe the one thing that's really jumped out to me as, like, maybe not the greatest part of that game. The dungeon design is something I have not gone back and looked at Xenosaga. If you don't know, I'm a big believer that Baten Kaitos and Xenosaga games had interesting dungeons, but I have not played them recently enough to any real depth to really reinforce that fact. I feel that way, but I don't necessarily know if that feeling is true, because that's something I've, like, experienced when I was, like, 15 to 18 or whatever. Like, whenever I played through Baten Kaitos games and Xenosaga games, right? Or to 20, actually, I think is around that. I don't remember. Like, I always forget, like, what order I played different video games and stuff. Disaster Day of Crisis is always the one that I first was, like, made me recognize Monolith Soft as a developer. But I don't necessarily remember if, like, I played Disaster Day of Crisis first. I'm pretty sure I played Disaster Day of Crisis before I played Baten Kaitos games, because I went and looked, and my reviews for Baten Kaitos games were, like, I think before my Disaster review, or maybe it's before the release date. I don't know. I need to go clear this up at some point, so I know I'm remembering things correctly. But at the Disaster was the thing that made me look at Monolith Soft and be like, oh, Disaster. Or the hit video game developer Monolith Soft, who created Disaster Day of Crisis. I'm getting off track here. But, like, the dungeon designs are something I can't really, like, I don't know if I can stand behind that. And I don't know if that's something I can really use in this conversation right now. I think the one thing I would say is that, like, I think Hackox as a game is a lot more solidly put together than something like a Xenosaga Episode 2, though. I feel like Xenosaga Episode 2 probably has its cracks, where I feel like Hackox has no cracks. It is, in some ways, I think it is, like, very, like, everything about Hackox feels really well thought out. And yeah, I think for me, it's going to go above Xenosaga Episode 2. I do think the story in the back half of Xenosaga Episode 2 is maybe not the strongest. Like, it wasn't as bad as I remembered it being, with, like, the Space Pope stuff. But I remember it, like, not necessarily, well, I don't know. I like the stuff with, like, Albedo and stuff like that towards the end. I mean, I think Junior's story in Xenosaga Episode 2 is just, like, really strong. It is probably one of the strongest stories in the Xenosaga franchise. And Xenosaga Episode 2 is, like, where a lot of that develops, as well as the stuff with, like, Momo and Ziggy and stuff. I feel like Xenosaga Episode 2 is, like, a big part of that as well, which is part of why, like, I think I like the story so much, because I like Junior and Momo. Momo and Ziggy combined. I don't know if I like Momo on her own that much. But, like, those three characters, I think, get their most development in Xenosaga Episode 2. I mean, they're definitely a part of Xenosaga Episode 3, but I feel like Episode 2 is, like, where things really matter for them. And, like, I think if you prefer, like, someone like Xion gets kind of, like, shoved to the back of the line in this game. And, like, there's things I appreciate about Xion as a character. She is not my favorite character in that game. And I think there's things that are very unique about Xion as a character, and I can see why people like Xion now. That was something that I had a hard time doing for a long time, but now I think I understand why people like Xion, and I see why she's, like, a fairly unique character, and I think I appreciate how Xion is as a character. But yeah, I think that's, like, one of the things that doesn't really bother me that much. It's like Episode 2. That's tight, though. It's a tight pass on that, I will say. So the question, I think, is like, is Hackox S rank worthy? Are we getting up here, baby? I think there's a question I'm asking myself right now in my head regarding Hackox, which is, does the length of Hackox matter? I think I mentioned at the start, like, it's like a 2-hour experience, I think, generally. Fairly short. I think there's value in short games, though. And I don't necessarily think that the longer something is, the better in a lot of ways. And obviously, these 3 games in front of here, I think, take all the time they need to tell their stories, right? I think Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is paced very well story-wise. Torna the Gold Country is a shorter RPG. I think Torna benefits from its short length, though, as much as its story kind of like suffers. But I think the problem with Torna's story is not so much from its length. I think it has more to do with just like the setting and foundation of it, and like what the game has to be story-wise to fit into Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So I think that's like the length part's not really a problem. I think Baten Kaitos is similar, where I think like lengthwise it's probably good and fine. And I feel like Hacox's length is good and fine. So I think it lines up with these games up here in terms of that. Could there have been more puzzle variety in Hacox? I don't necessarily think so. I feel like if Hacox was any longer, it would need more mechanics. I think that's the thing with Hacox. And I think, if I recall correctly, I think there are, like, levels that they have, like, if you go in the debug, there's, like, levels they didn't include that you can play. And, like, whether those were intended to be available at some point or not is a whole other thing. But, like, I don't know if I would want more of Hacox with how it is. And I can say that's definitely true with, like, all these other games up here, these 3 games up here. I'm pointing with my finger, but I need to use my mouse pointer. These, like Baten Kaitos, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and Xenoblade Chronicles, I don't think, like, they don't feel like games that suffer from their lack of length. And I don't feel like Hacox does either. I feel like Hacox is really solid in that regard. So I think Hacox is an S tier game. So I think it's going up here. I guess the question is Hacox above Xenoblade Chronicles? I have mixed feelings about Xenoblade Chronicles that I think these days, based off the franchise, which I think is sometimes unfair to Xenoblade Chronicles. Like, I think Xenoblade Chronicles as a whole is a solid game on its own. And I think it's strongest on its own as well. I think that's like the problem I have with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And like, assuming this video comes out, there's another video that I've made that I've ripped in out that like talks about this a little more in depth. But I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a game that is hurt by Xenoblade Chronicles, or I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is hurt by it as well, but Xenoblade Chronicles is a game that's hurt by its sequel, because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 kind of messes up the ending of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 in a way that Xenoblade Chronicles 1's ending didn't need to be messy. And so it's a problem that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 caused, in my opinion. But do I fault that on Xenoblade Chronicles 1? Because if you just play Xenoblade Chronicles 1, it's still that game. But if you think about Xenoblade Chronicles within the context of that, and what that means as a franchise, its importance is different. And in a way, I think in a worse way. So that's like one of the struggles I have with Xenoblade Chronicles, is that like, what does this game mean individually, and what does it mean to me as a franchise game? And I don't know what the right answer is. And the reality is probably that both answers are right? Like you can look at it both ways, and they mean different things. I don't think this, most of the time with video games and stuff like this garbage that we're talking about all the time, that's like, doesn't matter most of the time. Like you can look at it both ways, and they're both completely valid ways to look at it. And there's definitely valid thoughts, right? Of like, oh, this game's standalone versus this game is a franchise game. Gosh. All right, this is the nitpicky zone. Xenoblade Chronicles 1. It's very big. And what I mean by very big, I mean it is a game full of space. This is a hard thing to talk about. So, one argument I've seen from people who don't like Xenoblade Chronicles 1 as much, and I think I don't know if I really recognize this until I recently played it, and I don't know if it's something I ever felt. I feel like back in the day I didn't feel this. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is a game with a lot of open, empty space, despite the game being designed in a way that it's very, it's not like an open world game. It's very much, I've talked about this before, like Xenoblade Chronicles has paths, and those paths are more suggestions to the player, I think, a lot of times. And sometimes these are literally paths where it's like literally there's a path on the ground or there's like a bridge you can follow. And other times I think this is a path of landmarks, something that draws your eye. And like I think this is part of where like Zelda, you know, if you want to think about Monolith Soft's impact on Zelda, the franchise, right? This is probably the thing that probably matters the most. It's like what does it mean to move around the Xenoblade Chronicles world? And I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles is about showing the player essentially, you know, it doesn't always have to be 3 things, but 3 things, and saying, I can go this way, or this way. There is space in between these things. And that space often has nothing of interest in there. It's just space. But you can go there if you want, right? But the players naturally is going to go, I want to go to this waterfall. I want to follow the path. Or I want to go in this castle, right? And so each path, and I think Xenoblade Chronicles 1, eventually takes you to the end of that area. Like, they all kind of congregate. And sometimes they congregate earlier. It's like, oh, we kind of bring you back. Here's this little point in the path where it all kind of connects together. And to the player, it's very clear, this is the direction to go to where you need to go next. But this is where we kind of bring you all together, and then we have the 3 different landmarks again if you want to split off and go down those paths. I think Torn of the Golden Country does this pretty well as well, although in a lot more of a limited scope than Xenoblade Chronicles 1. But it is just kind of like, there's just like a lot of space, and if you, the player, if you go off the track of what they want to show you, there's sometimes just like kind of nothing. And also, just like in general, the scale of the world feels very big. And I think that's important for, you know, communicating to the player how big the world is at times. But yeah, I don't really know. Like, I think people have problems with like the time it can take to get from thing to thing to thing, I think. And I do have that problem with like some open world games. That's not really my problem with Xenoblade Chronicles, though. It's like back to the Xenosaga thing where like, I don't really have that issue per se, though. Or at least I do not have that issue being a memory in my head. And in revisiting the game, I don't really remember that being a real problem. But if you sit there and showed me video of that game and said, look at this space, I'd probably go, yeah, that's space. With that. This is like one of those things, we're back to like the Disaster Day of Crisis situation where we're like comparing games that are very different, and maybe introducing Hackox to this list as a puzzle action game is the biggest mistake we can have, and like creating yet another weird like point for us where it's like Disaster, where I'm like, I don't even want to talk about Disaster, we don't have to. Let's compare all the games around Disaster first and then get into the Disaster conversation. But yeah, Hackox, man. Is it better than Xenoblade Chronicles 1? Is it something I would rank higher than Xenoblade Chronicles 1? Do I care about Hackox more than I care about Xenoblade Chronicles 1? I will say, Xenoblade Chronicles 1 as a game, I think is a lot more conservative than a lot of Monolith Soft games. However, I think the design decisions they make are more rounded. And like, I guess what I mean by that is like, I feel like they make interesting decisions in all aspects of Xenoblade Chronicles as a video game. However, they never take one aspect too far, right? I think that's like one thing you can maybe look at the Xeno series where like, it kind of feels like they are like, this is the thing we really want to differentiate this franchise. We're going to really throw ourselves into that thing. And then combat and story are kind of the 2 pillars of that. Where I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles, there's just a lot more going on. And while it's not maybe as extreme with the choices it makes enough different and interesting choices that it creates a game that's ultimately different and interesting feeling, even if it's not like that crazy. I don't know, man. Do I have problems with Xenoblade Chronicles 1? I mean, what are my problems with Xenoblade Chronicles 1? Do I have any problems with Hackox? I don't think I have any problems with Hackox. It is inaccessible, but I don't think that's part of its problem. That's a Xenoblade Chronicles or Xenosaga Episode 3 issue, not a Hackox issue. Like part of me is like, okay, presentation wise, Hackox is pretty conservative. There's not a lot of different things to look at. But I think considering the game and what you need to be doing into it, the less like visual noise, the better. And so I think it's better that they change very subtle aspects of the background. You know, when you're in the green area, there's like seagulls cawing, but like when you're in the lava looking area, there's no seagulls cawing and stuff like that. And the music is all, I think, as far as I can tell, like kind of repurposed music, although like different layers of it are removed. And I think the right layers of music are removed to make it be like, oh, this is puzzle music. Even though this is like a recognizable Xenosaga song, it's puzzle music instead because it's a lot more like laid back. So I think the music, even though it's like a lot of the same music, I think it's very smartly cut in certain places. So I think the presentation there is good. I think the music in general is just really good. I think, okay, Xenoblade Chronicles, I don't love that soundtrack. Like, I think it's fine. There's some songs in there I really like, but I think the majority of it, you could delete it from my life and my mind and I would not recognize it's gone. Hackawk's music, I think I would recognize from my life it was gone. I do like Hackawk's music. I think it's really good. I think it fits the feel of that game a lot. I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles music, a lot of it I could just do without. Sorry, my hair is going crazy. We're getting worked up here, so I'm like brushing my hair. Is music enough? Is music enough to push Hackawks over Xenoblade Chronicles? I mean, like, we're in the S tier, right? Like, it's gonna be these dumb nitpicky things. We're gonna put it up there. Okay. Next question. Is Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torn of the Golden Country? As I mentioned before, I think story-wise, Torn of the Golden Country isn't great, but I think that's just more of an issue of Xenoblade Chronicles 2's positioning of it. I don't think it's really Torn of the Golden Country's fault. I think they do the best they can with the cards they were given in that regard. My cat just woke up. Hello, kitty. I'm gonna pet you. Oh, cute little baby. I think Torna's music is actually really good. I think it's probably one of my more favorite Xenoblade Chronicles OSTs. Do I have any problems with Torna, really? There's like some very slight issues with Torna, the Golden Country. Very slight issues. I think Torna the Golden Country is a game that is kind of everything Xenoblade Chronicles 2 should have been, other than the story. And again, I don't think the story is really a problem. Like, I don't want to punish it for its story too much, I guess, is the thing. I worry that if I punish Torna for the story, I don't know, I feel like it's just like a bad precedent. Because I feel like... oh god. I think Torna's... Okay, here's the thing I want to say about Torna's story. We're defending Torna right now. When I look at something like Future Redeemed, much lower on this list, obviously, I think Future Redeemed has problems due to its relationships to the games it's talking about. However, I think it has more... I think Torna handles them fairly gracefully. There's like one scene where it's like Mithra and seeing Rex, which I think just doesn't really make a lot of sense and just isn't really worthwhile. But I think it's like that's the one scene I can think of. It does give you some interesting backstory on certain characters, like what's her name? The Flame Lady. I forget her name. Brigitte. That's definitely the chink in its armor, I will say. I don't know. I don't think that scene with Rex is a bad thing per se. I mean, The scene, if I recall correctly, has something to do with like the different drivers and like is this my ultimate fate? I think, right? Is this my ultimate duty? And then being like, oh no, there's probably somebody in the future you need to like help as well. It's been a long time. I feel like that scene had some value in it outside of just that. It was like 2018. So it's been like half a decade at this point. Jeez. I don't know, man. Let me ignore Torna for a second. I'm staring at Baten Kaitos, and like part of my brain is like, Baten Kaitos has a lot of problems. And why is Baten Kaitos so high on this list? And I think it's because Baten Kaitos' systems all fit each other very well. And I think Hackox is in a similar place as Baten Kaitos, where all the systems just interlock super nicely. And Baten Kaitos feels like it's in that place along with Hackox. Is Torna the Golden Country in that place? I don't know if I can say that's true about Torna. Sometimes I wonder if maybe Torna's a little too high on this list. I don't have a problem with it where it being where it is, but sometimes I wonder if like Torna as a game that fixed a lot of problems with Xenosaga Episode 2, it's kind of nice because you can see where the problems were with Xenosaga 2 and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Where the problems were with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and like how they implemented a better iteration of that. And so it's like, oh, these are clearly better choices, better decisions. These fit better. This fits the driver like blade relationship so much better from a story perspective. I think if that was what Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was from the beginning, I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 would be up here. So I think Torna's fine where it's at. In terms of being up here. So I had a moment where I just like was doubting my rankings here for a moment. So I was just like, I just want to make sure. Oh, God. Is Torna in the place that Hackox is, though? I think with Hackox, it's much clearer. Or with Torna, well, with Torna, many of its like driver blade dynamics aren't as represented there versus Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And I think part of that has to do with just the smaller scale of it. So certain elements of the story, I feel like, I don't know, like I feel like the driver blade stuff works really well with the story actually in Torna. If this is what it was, I'm very happy about this right here, I will say. I'm pretty sure it's not above Baten Kaitos. At this point. Maybe I'll play Baten Kaitos in the future again at some point and be like, oh, whoops. But at least right now, there's a lot of things I like about Baten Kaitos and how it works, even though it has problems. But I think those offset those problems. Let me move it, just feel how I feel about that. Am I okay living the life where I turn to somebody and say, what are your favorite Monolith Soft games? And I say, Baten Kaitos and Hackox. In some ways, that's kind of fun, but I shouldn't do just because it's fun, right? If I really wanted to have fun, Disaster Day of Crisis would be way higher on this list. Disaster Day of Crisis being a C rank is something I personally don't necessarily like, but it's there because it needs to be there. But I guess, does that feel comfortable? Do I feel comfortable saying that? Like, Hackox is better than Xenoblade Chronicles 2? Torn of the Golden Country? I feel comfortable saying that. I think Torn of the... Like, Hackox feels... Oh, God. The thought in my head just entered my head, and I don't want this thought here, so I'm going to throw it out. But like, my brain was like, well, it's a mini game in another game, so it's even more impressive. No, I don't want that to be a part of this conversation. Let's get that out here. I can say this. Hackox is a game that in some ways changes how I feel about puzzle games. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torn of the Golden Country, I don't think changes how I feel about RPGs. Baten Kaitos gets pretty close to that, I think. Baten Kaitos is a very formative RPG for me in a lot of ways, I think. Skies of Arcadia may be a bit more so, but that's not a Monolith Soft conversation. I think Hackox is number 2, baby. I think this is our list. This is our list. All right. I'm glad we got there. That was a hard one. That's really hard. I would not be surprised if that maybe... I don't know. Part of me is like, maybe I wouldn't be surprised if that moves, but I think it's just... The only reason I say that is because it's so different here. On the bright side, because it's so high on this list, there's very little chance you're going to have this conversation again anytime soon. I really like Torn of the Golden Country, so if that's like the first conversation I have to have, that's like a nice buffer there, honestly. I think it's once it gets above Torna. You know, if we're getting above Torna, we're getting a place that's kind of crazy. And I would love Monolith Soft to get back to there at some point, but I feel like my personal opinion right now is that if Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is an indicator of where we're going, that's probably not going to be the case. But Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is the end of the trilogy, essentially, right? And obviously the DLC, it's its own thing, in a part of that trilogy. I think if we look at like the next Monolith Soft game, Xenoblade, probably in name, but you know, hopefully not directly in everything else. There's a very good chance we could end up at this S rank again. I think if Xenoblade Chronicle, if the next Xenoblade Chronicle comes out and it looks like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, we're probably not getting this high again. I could be wrong. I think if Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was like perfectly executed and had a lot of the things that I like of a Monolith Soft game included in there somehow that like really distinguished it. But if it's built on that foundation still, I think we're probably going to get up to like A rank at best at this point. I think Torna gets the benefit of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 being just like so unique at its time from Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and Xenoblade Chronicles X. And so like doing the better iteration of that and like making a lot of very smart changes, I think is like worked out for it. So I don't know. We'll see. But anyways, Hackox. I'm glad we're here. That's all I'll say. I'm glad this is our list right now. So again, I don't know when this is coming out. Maybe Monolith Soft has announced their next thing. Maybe they haven't announced their next thing. Hopefully I made a video about Hackox. Given how high it is on this list, I feel like I gotta. And I feel like I have a lot of feelings about Hackox that need to be released from my body. But, you know, I don't think by the time I think I will get a Hackox video done before I play in these other games at the very least down here. So I think we're pretty safe that this is the next one. If not, we'll have a conversation at some point about how this whole thing works out. I will make this make sense somehow. But today, Hackox is the second best Monolith Soft game. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I had a great time on this one. This was an interesting piece to fit in this puzzle, but I'm glad we did it. So thank you guys so much, and we'll be back for either one of these games below, or whenever another Monolith Soft game happens, or whenever I have an epiphany about any of these other titles that I feel like I need to re-rank them. So, all right.